Now, if we want to achieve a particular desired action, right, we need certain tools. And I do want to talk about the 4 topics I'm going to list on my screen. I do want to talk about motivation. I want to talk about triggers. I want to talk about response, and I want to talk about the process. Now, first of all, let me talk about motivation. Some people may be thinking, well, motivation is not that important. You know, you hear sometimes people saying motivation is not important, just focus on the routine, blah, 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 blah. Extrinsic motivation is not important. And extrinsic motivation won't keep you going. It won't make you trade for years and years. If you're so obsessed with extrinsic motivation, such as money, you won't end up trading for years and years. That means ignore the extrinsic motivation part, but focus on the intrinsic motivation. If you ignore the intrinsic motivation, you will end up every single month, you will be sitting there and thinking, should I just give up trading? Yeah, because that would be a normal reaction. This is a normal reaction if you ignore the intrinsic motivation part. The intrinsic motivation part is like your inner voice that you need to connect with. You need to work with your intrinsic motivation. Your intrinsic motivation helps you to trick your brain into doing the right things. We're going to talk about what these right things are, but the intrinsic motivation helps you to trick your brain into doing the right things. That means into convincing to your brain to do the right things, because your brain wants to know what is the benefit for me if I do the right things. I mean, if there are no benefits whatsoever, you know, from a biological point of view, you would just not do it. Yeah, that means your failures, you keep failing at day trading because there is some sort of a benefit for you. You understand? Do you understand that? Because usually from a biological point of view, you would stop, you'd basically stop doing what you're doing if there is no benefit for you. If, as long as there is a benefit for you, you'd basically continue. And that's the reason why you need to convince and why you need to connect with your intrinsic motivation to understand what the benefit of doing the right things is, right? So that means, what I mean is, now the intrinsic motivation covers the parts of sources of enjoyment, accomplishment, and knowledge. Now that means either convince yourself that if you do the right things, that means, for example, having a stop loss that makes sense, etc. Let's take this example. Now, placing a reasonable stop loss, right? Sometimes we basically tend to think, well, without a stop loss, it may work better. For example, that could be your thought, right? Now, you want to convince yourself why to use a stop loss. Now, what you can do is, in order to trigger your intrinsic motivation, is either tell yourself, either say, well, if I do that, right, if I basically use my stop loss in a reasonable way, this has something to do with knowledge. That means basically tell yourself, well, you know, knowing more about stop losses and how to place them, that gives you some sort of enjoyment. You do want to understand how you can, this is some sort of a challenge for you. You know, you basically tell yourself, I get the enjoyment of trading out of me placing the stop loss properly, right? Not placing it somewhere, but you enjoy the process and you focus on the element of that. You basically tell yourself, this is like acquiring knowledge. This is something that is good for you. And a human desire is to learn for your own sake. That means that could be something that makes sense for you. Or you could basically tell yourself, you could basically focus on the accomplishment part. You could say, this is like a challenge. I want to be the trader who understands how to place a proper stop loss. I spent so much time into placing stop losses in different zones, and I am mastering my stop loss so well. I am proud of myself because I spent years and years challenging myself, finding the perfect stop loss. You understand? It's the wording, actually. It's the wording. Or you could basically also tell yourself that you could also experience, or you could also tell yourself that this is basically fun and pleasure. Placing stop loss properly, learning the whole process of trading itself is fun and pleasure, and not the outcome of money. You understand? It's the wording. That means your mindset. When the market opens, right? The market opens, you're sitting there, you did your analysis, and then you have to put yourself into the right mindset. When you put yourself into the right mindset, ask yourself, do I want to satisfy the knowledge aspect? Do I want to satisfy the accomplishment aspect? That means challenging aspect. Do I want to satisfy the experience aspect? That means gaining fun and pleasure and enjoyment from working, working in a certain way. You understand? That means you basically put yourself in the right mindset, and the right mindset is triggering your intrinsic motivation, focusing on different fields. Then we move on. That was the motivation part, right? That was the motivation part. Now I do want to talk about the triggers and the response. Now, you must be familiar with this grid right here in the middle, where it says behavior 1, behavior 2, behavior 3, because this is something I used in another webinar, and there I told you that habit tracking is, I'd say, out of my experience of 10 years of trading, I'd say the most powerful tool on earth is habit tracking. You can become the persona you want to if you keep doing what you actually planned on your habit tracking, because your overall actions, an action is usually, the very source. Let me begin again. The very source of any action is a trigger. All right, is a trigger, isn't it? And your task as a day trader is to eliminate the bad triggers by making them invisible. This is something that was suggested in the book Atomic Habits, and I'd absolutely recommend to you to read this book. This is such a fantastic book for all day traders out there, Atomic Habits. It's very useful. And there it basically says, eliminate, get rid of the bad triggers by making them invisible. That means, for example, so what I know from some traders is, I sometimes hear people saying, well, sometimes I feel so exhausted and I just don't want to analyze a chart. So I basically listen to other day traders on YouTube or somewhere else, right? I let them analyze, and then I go back to my chart and I take a particular trade. This is something very bad, because you can only benefit from your own analysis. You understand? Because your analysis is your wording, is your understanding, and based on your understanding, you're going to take a particular trade. And you really rely on your analysis. It doesn't help you much when someone else does the analysis, because, yeah, you are not, you will never fully understand their thought process. So that means eliminating, getting rid of all the bad triggers means, or if you're asking yourself, what does that mean, making something like that invisible? Well, just on those days when you feel very exhausted and you don't feel like trading, then just don't trade. Instead of, opening YouTube and listening to other people and then taking a trade based on what someone said, it's much better than not to trade at all. That means making those sources invisible means deinstall or just delete those apps or whatever, and don't trade at all those days. And enhancing the positive triggers, because as we said, where was it? Yeah. enhancing the positive triggers to make good choices means that, for example, having a trading journal and keeping a habit tracker, is a good, is a positive trigger, isn't it? It's a positive trigger, having a habit tracker. That means because this is a positive trigger, have your habit tracker in your trading journal, have it on your desktop, have it printed out, carry it with you wherever you go. That means multiply those triggers in order to support yourself. Or when you prepare, you know, in the evening, when you leave your desk or whatever, right, put your habit tracking on your desk. That means the first thing you do in the morning when you sit at your desk and analyze the chart, etc., you first of all do your habit tracking. Support yourself by multiplying the positive triggers. Because the point is, and that's the dangerous part, how you react to your gaps, right? You have all these gaps. How you react to those gaps, right, will actually decide whether you can effectively bridge the discrepancy or not. That means if your reaction to this gap is, well, you know what, let's say that's your intention. I want to become a day trader. And then by the end of the month, you see there are no wins whatsoever. And then what you do is your reaction is, I will find a prop firm and I will continue my trading career there. Well, that is not, and I'm not against prop firms, right? Don't misunderstand. I just said that because out of personal reasons, but I'm not against prop firms. It may be the right path for you. But if this is your reaction, you know, I want to become a day trader, and then you end up with no wins whatsoever, and then your reaction is, and I said reacting the right way is very important. Now your reaction is, I go up and find a prop firm. This is not a good reaction, because you're not looking, you're not trying hard enough. And I said it will take you, you know, years and years of work. It will take you a lot of time. You're not looking, you're not taking the time to understand how your psychological processes work, how you can actually, you're not asking yourself, what is that small atomic thing I have to change on my journey, right? If you are not asking this question, if you have not been, you know, you have to, as I said, you have to dedicate time for that, and it will take a lot of time. And every time you get closer, one step closer to your goal. That means every time you keep a trading journal, ask yourself, what small element, what small piece, what small, you know, atomic piece is still missing. This is your task. Your task is not to blame it on, you know, or to basically look for, you won't find answers in the outside world. You will find answers in the inside world. It sounds very spiritual, but this is actually what I would say is the best thing to do. You have to sit down and find all these atomic elements that need some sort of adjustment, etc. This is very important. So that means how you react to something is very important. How you react to that particular gap, right? What the consequence is going to decide whether you will continue trading or not, guys. Because at the end of the day, after, you know, if your reaction is frustration, then you'll end up burnt out completely after a couple of years. That means you need to enjoy the process, the overall process. Now, the last part I do want to talk about is, as I said, is the process part, right? Now, the process, what I mean with that is you want to become a consistently successful trader, right? That's your goal. So you do something, you act on your intention, but there is a barrier here, a barrier in the sense of one atomic piece is just not, it just doesn't fit to the overall you know, to the overall setting. That means every now and then we do something, every now and then you end up with a bad choice. You need to find that trigger that leads to that bad choice, right? So that means one atomic thing is missing, and this is actually the barrier. If you ignore that, you will always end up doing the wrong things again and again for the next 100 years. Yeah. So that means if there is a barrier, you need to have, and in order to understand what your barrier is, you need to keep a journal where you not only have your analysis for the day, right, but also where you analyze yourself. That means your thought process, right? Is there something that makes you, for example, are you a revenge trader, or is there something that, you know, makes you take a particular trade because of a certain, you know, scenario? That means you need to understand, if you keep a journal, if you analyze your overall thought process, you would understand what your barrier is. And then you could actually then think about a solution here. And as I said, the most important thing is, and the most important thing is usually no drastic change is needed. There is no such thing. You don't need to change drastically, fundamentally. There is usually just a very small part you need to find that just doesn't match the intention action part. You know, usually 90% of the time you do very well, right, throughout the month, or not 90%, maybe, I don't know, 70% of the time, right, you do very well. And then the 30% lead to the fact that you end up miserable. That means you need to find what makes you, you know, what triggers the 30%. And you can only do that if you keep an eye on yourself, if you focus on yourself. Don't look for answers in the outside world, because you won't find any, right? An example would be, if you get stopped out every time you set a stop loss, the solution is not, well, from now on, I won't set any stop losses. That's not the solution, right? No drastic fundamental reactions, never. That's not a good thing. No fundamental reaction. That means a drastic reaction would be, all right, I won't use any stop losses from now on. I think that doesn't make sense. What type of a strategy is this if you have, you know, if you enter in the middle of nowhere and you're like, well, I could possibly make 400, you know, you understand? That means using a stop loss. Stop loss basically means, in very simple words, stop loss means if this and this happens, if a certain scenario happens, my overall idea why I entered a particular trade is basically wrong. That means this scenario should not happen. If this scenario happens, I am willing to quit the game. I am willing to close my trade, because I enter a trade based off a logic, right? Not based off a candlestick anyway. So based off a logic. That means if a certain scenario happens, that's the definition of stop loss. If a certain scenario happens, that means I need to quit, I need to close my trade, because under those, you know, circumstances, my idea why I entered that particular trade would be wrong. So here, your reaction shouldn't be not using any stop loss, but it should be rather studying what the correct idea, you know, studying how to place stop losses properly. This should be your reaction. A couple of weeks ago, I saw on YouTube someone, a so-called day trader, said, well, now with all the crisis with Ukraine, etc., we shouldn't be trading, blah, 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 blah. Well, welcome to the real world. I mean, we have a crisis every single year. There is a major crisis every single year. If crisis and politicians decide whether I trade or not, I would probably not have a chance to trade anyway. You understand? If this makes you, this would be a fundamental, a drastic reaction. A normal reaction would be, is there something I need to bear in mind because of the current situation, right? Maybe a current situation could mean the market is volatile. In that scenario, I would make sure that I don't let trades run for a couple of days. I would usually, let my trade run for a couple of hours. I would set tight or tighter stop losses, etc. For example, as I said, that's the GBP, that's GBP USD, that's the monthly situation. When you see the monthly situation, already what you can tell from this chart, right? Even without doing an in-depth analysis, what you can see is after this major break, after this major violation of that zone right here, what we have as a reaction is a long-lagged doji. This already shows there is a lot of indecisiveness on the market. You understand? This already gives you an atomic hint for you to adjust the way you trade. Just a small adjustment to your overall trading strategy. Whatever your trading plan is and whatever your trading strategies are based on your trading plan, whatever they are, what everyone can do now is if you see this scenario does not mean don't trade at all, right? This scenario just means, well, there is a lot of indecisiveness. There is going to be a lot of testing to the low of the month, but there is also going to be a lot of testing to the upper side. That means because of that, a lot of testing and indecisiveness, I already know that I need to be careful and set my stop loss probably a bit tighter than usual. This is it. You understand? So that means you do you take these atomic steps to improve your overall performance. And this is how you get closer, to your overall goal to become a successful day trader. It never happens with, your success in any field actually in life never comes from a drastic change, a fundamental change, right? That's just very stupid. So what you have to do is very small steps, atomic steps, and every time asking and reflecting what small piece is still missing. And that's going to take you years and years of work.